Hello, everybody. Welcome to our panel discussion on moving through the plays, a journey in accommodation and inclusion management. I am Stephen Irish, the Service Manager for Business Solutions at the Canadian Council of Rehabilitation and Work, and I will be our monitor for today's panel discussion. I'm joined today by Melissa Egan, who represents the Canadian Accessibility Network, otherwise known as CAN, our partner for today's panel discussion. Today's panelists are Amuna Baraka Clark from Loft Community Services, Dr. Barb Verley from Layla Care Specialty Programs, and Wendy Porch from the Center for Independent Living, Toronto. So just a few housekeeping items as we get started. Following the presentation today, there will be a Q&A session. We'll also be hosting a network session at 2:05 to 2:25, which will provide individuals an opportunity to join the discussion and to share their ideas and thoughts. So I will start today with a brief introduction on the Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work. So Mel, can you move me to the next slide there? Thank you. So the Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, our mission is to promote and support meaningful and equitable employment for people with disabilities. We support job seekers in accessing the tools and confidence they need to educate and market themselves in today's labor market. CCRW also supports employers in accessing qualified talent while providing education, training, and resources to support businesses in becoming disability confident. I'll now pass it over to Melissa Egan, who will provide some information on the Canadian Accessibility Network.
Hi, everyone. My name is Melissa Egan. I'm the National Lead of Episodic Disabilities at Realize, and I sit on the Employment Domain Area Committee of the Canadian Accessibility Network. And we are a national network, which is under the leadership of the READ Initiative at Carleton University. And it's a collaboration which represents academic as well as community service provider and corporate partners who are committed to advancing accessibility for persons with disabilities. And we do this through research, design and innovation, education and training, policy, employment, and community engagement. We are thrilled to be part of this session alongside the CCRW and these amazing organizational representatives. So I will hand it back over to Stephen so that we can get rolling.
Thank you so much, Melissa. So today's presentation is all around building inclusive workplaces with a focus on CCRW's Accommodation and Inclusion Management Service, otherwise known as AIM. So AIM is a service for employers and employees seeking assistance with accommodations. At the core of workplace accommodation is open, trust-based communication between an employer and its employee. Historically, workplace accommodations have revolved around removing barriers to participation based upon an individual's disability. AIM offers a new perspective, a demedicalized approach to accommodating employees based on obstacles to success/productivity, medicalized or not. Our AIM playbook offers curated best practice guidance for managers and supervisors through a series of plays. We challenge you to apply each in a tailored, flexible, and thoughtful manner. So the next slide that I have here is some research that we have conducted as part of our pilot project for accommodation and inclusion management as also as part of our ongoing service delivery. So a few things that I want to highlight here, types of accommodations or workplace adjustments that we have supported employers in accessing include hard accommodations such as ergonomic furniture, technical hardware, and assistive technology, as well as soft accommodations such as training, flexible work hours, increased frequency of breaks. We found that in the AIM project phase, the average cost of an accommodation was approximately $1,200. 36% of employees with disabilities aged 25 to 64 required at least one workplace accommodation. And the most common requested items or workplace accommodations were flexible work arrangements, workstation modifications, human or technical supports. And for each of those, I'll read through the percents. So 27% identified a flexible work arrangement, 15% workstation modification, and 6% a human or technical support. So now, moving through the plays. As I mentioned on my previous slide, our playbook offers best practice guidance through a series of plays, starting with Rethink Disability. Reshape negative attitudes, which is fortunate for us. Attitudes are learned and can be relearned. Challenge your own biases. The next play is to Prepare. Identify and train key players. Conversations about accommodations and disability can be uncomfortable for you and your employee, but it does not have to be. Mutual respect and open, honest communication is key. Followed by Going the Distance. Identify a process. Identify workplace barriers and accommodations. Engage in conversations with your employee or employees. Remember, they are the experts in this situation. Review, evaluate, and evolve. Anticipate barriers and provide solutions. This is all about being proactive. And finally, build your disability confidence. Move the needle. Are you ready? So today's panelists are Amuna Baraka-Clark, Senior Director, People and Culture at Loft Community Services, Wendy Porch, Executive Director for the Center for Independent Living Toronto, and Dr. Barbara Verley, Manager of Clinical Services, Layla Care Specialty Programs. Amuna will be getting us started today in terms of the panel discussions, and I will be introducing each of the panelists as we go. Over to you, Amuna.
Okay, thanks. Thank you for having me today. I'm really looking forward to the learning as well as part of this panel. I work for Loft Community Services. We are an organization based in Ontario, and we provide support to people who are facing complex mental health challenges. One of our mantras at the organization is a dignified life for everyone. And so when thinking about accommodations and disability, that's sort of a thread that runs through our work as a people and culture team. What I wanted to speak about today is the difficulty some employees have in returning to work after they've been off on a long-term disability leave. Unfortunately, many employees aren't able to sort of navigate that gap between being on leave and returning to work. And we know that in a lot of cases, the work that we can do as employers doesn't go far enough. So I wanted to talk about a case or a situation that we think sort of a new voyage for us, but in the end had really amazing results. We know that like returning to work after a leave due to disability, it can be a complicated set of conditions. It's like overwhelming at times for the employees, especially if their disability forces them to return to a new position and not something that they were in before. The employee that I want to speak about today was on long-term disability for 2 years. Due to a slip and fall accident, they became quite disabled. They had considerable mobility challenges. They needed to use a walker. There were also sort of cognitive issues that they needed to navigate newly. And their role prior to the accident, they were out in the community providing one-to-one support in a variety of settings to people who have addictions issues, as well as various complex mental health challenges. While they were off, we knew that it was really important for us to keep in touch with the employee during that time. So perhaps quarterly, their supervisor would reach out just to see how they were doing. And we knew that as it got sort of around the 2-year mark and we had learned a little bit about how their progress was going, the director started to co-create a process with them in thinking about what return to work would look like. Naturally, there was a lot of consultation with professionals. We got a lot of information about what they were able to do and what they wouldn't be able to do. And we soon realized it would be very difficult for them to return to the work that they were able to do prior to the accident. Our conversations also really highlighted for us that they were very motivated and that they were ready to return to work, I think we realize that it's important to think about, you know, an employee's ability to realistically perform their job duties without causing further harm to their health. And we knew that returning to work, you know, can also compromise recovery, and also put, you know, employees in an awkward position. So we wanted to be very mindful of getting a sense of when the doctor had cleared them to work, as well as when they were, I don't know, mentally ready to take on a new work routine. Once we got information from the doctor, we realized that the person, again, wouldn't be able to do the one-to-one work with the employees, but we knew that the knowledge that they held around the support that our clients needed was something that could be really valuable in us being able to continue to provide service. And we knew that they also needed many, I think what Stephen called sort of hard accommodations. So there were a lot of equipment that we needed to buy. Looked at desk space. They needed a standing desk. They needed a special type of mouse, as well as a keyboard, a special type of headset, as well as dictation software. And we also had to provide them with a situation that would allow them to be able to work from home on days when they weren't, you know, really at their optimal state, as well as ensuring that they would still be able to work within the office, because sometimes those supports needed to happen in that space as well. We also learned from the assessment that it was important to provide frequent breaks during the position. And so that was also, you know, the work that we do, it tends to be very busy. And so initially, it took a lot of time for the directors to think about how we would be able to manage gaps when the employee needed, you know, perhaps more than 15 minutes away from their role to be able to do that. But that was also through the use of technology and also teamwork with their coworkers. We were able to sort of navigate what could have been a barrier, but really became an opportunity for other coworkers to be able to inform the process that we used to provide referrals for our employees, or to support, not our employees, to provide referrals for our clients, as well as to help with some of the information that needed to happen from one colleague to another. A lot of that we were able to do because our staff was able to review their skill set and talk about the different pieces that they were still able to do, or different things that they were able to take on in terms of the work that we needed to do. I want to share that what was really interesting in this case is they didn't take on a brand new role, but they did, I guess, through talking about some of the needs that we had in the program and the prior knowledge that they had in terms of their role, they were able to show us some of the gaps that we had in the way that we were providing service, and took on sort of a new iteration of service provision for our clients that, you know, prior to their injury and prior to them returning, it was an area that we weren't able to like fully access or support our clients. And so for us, we saw that as a huge win. I will say that the barrier for us was really not knowing what things we could provide. It was really helpful for us to be able to partner with professionals so that we can get information about, you know, the host of equipment that's out there that we could support our staff with, as well as some of the supports that they needed in terms of making that transition. I think that was another part that was really important for us. And then being able to make that change at a pace that was manageable. It resonated for me when Stephen talked about like review, evaluate, and evolve, because that's sort of been a continual part of this process. They've now been back to work about 6 months, and in their work with their supervisor, that's continued to be a piece just to get a sense of what's working, what's not working, the changes that we need to make. And I would say that for our people and culture team, We don't quite have a playbook as good as the one that you have with your organization, but it's helped us to look at our policies to make sure that there aren't things that we're missing, and that we also ensure that our employees are always involved in how this process moves forward.
Thank you so much, Amuna. And I know you highlighted one of the plays in continuing to review and evolve, but I also thought the case that you discussed really did highlight the first play in rethinking disability, in that I felt it was very individualized. So understanding that disability is diverse and no two disabilities are the same. So thank you so much. So our next panelist for today is Dr. Barb Verley, who will be joining us today from Layla Care Specialty Programs, and passing it over to you now, Barb.
Hello, hi everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this discussion today, Stephen. I want to tell you a little bit more about, excuse me, what we do at Layla Care, and give you a little bit of an overview of who we are. So in general way, Layla Care has two sides to our shop, but all of us are driven by the same philosophy, and our vision is to create a human-first, technology-powered mental health service. We like to think we're built on quality, patient centricity, and innovation. Layla is very new. We were only established in 2019 in the Greater Toronto area. Everything is virtual now, and that wasn't the intent, but then COVID, so here we are. And now we actually have employees who live and work across Ontario, everywhere from Sault Ste. Marie to Ottawa, Niagara, Toronto. And we've recently actually opened a new office in Calgary, Alberta, because we're hoping to expand our services there. Our specific values are that we're patient-centric, we're dependable, we're proactive, we promote diversity, and we work as one team. So my role in the program, and again, the whole organization is very new. I'm also very new in that I've only been with the company since January. First as a consulting clinical psychologist, and after that, since August, I've been working as the manager of clinical services for one of our specialty programs. Layla has two sides. Our specialty program provides mental health service to workers who've been injured on the job. So this is done through referrals from WSIB and in partnership with Trillium Health. On the other side of our shop, we have a roster of over 100 contract mental health providers who provide service to individuals, any individual who's looking for mental health support. And that can include individual, group, or couples therapy. So I thought I'd share with you today some of our thoughts on accessibility and inclusion. Again, we're very new, but what's exciting about that is it gives us a chance to build some of the protocols and use some of the great resources that organizations like CCRW have offered. So we currently take a number of steps to ensure that our recruitment process is inclusive and accessible. Some of examples of that are that we are quite transparent and explicit in our job advertisements. And we always include a diversity and accommodation statement so that folks with disabilities and other equity deserving groups can make a better informed decision about whether or not this position might be a good fit for them. And as a smaller organization, of course, we're learning along the way. We're always striving to make our workplace more accessible. So we're just starting to kind of consult and liaise with organizations like CCRW, and all in the service of making everyone in our organization feel more comfortable and have what they need in order to be successful. Accommodations are always offered right from the start of someone's employment with us, but we also build in flexibility to approach us at any time to ask for, again, what one needs in order to be successful. And we have an overt statement on our website about organizational values, and again, that we promote diversity of all kinds. In our recruitment process, we always include a discussion about the pace of our work and the culture of us being a startup. So things are prone to change quickly. We're always, kind of pivoting in midair, and that's a great fit for some folks and not for others. So we just want folks to make an informed choice. We're continuing to work on how we communicate and promote vacancies in an inclusive way, but we do try to advertise in a range of channels. We're actively attending events out there, specifically right now to find tech talent. We are also exploring student positions that might partner us with organizations who support people from equity deserving groups. Um, and so some of the practical ways that we're supporting our employees right now um, are things like, the whole work from home environment, which I think we're learning more and more about, but can be especially accommodating for people with disabilities. So we have one employee, for example, who's suffering from the impact of a head injury. So obviously, stimulation and loud shared office space probably wouldn't be a great fit for this person, but they've already stated that they love this virtual environment. It really helps in terms of them feeling productive and comfortable working from home. Again, we're trying to be proactive in identifying and educating ourselves about how we can make spaces more accessible and not relying on the individual with a disability to tell us how to do that. Certainly asking for input, but not relying on them exclusively to implement or to figure out what needs to happen. We invest in our employees' home office space, so we provide a startup budget to everyone, and then we talk about accommodations from there should more be required. And I'm mindful of time, so I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. We're constantly asking for feedback, again, from everyone. So we have regular staff surveys that are sent out. And again, because we're a startup, we have a really agile environment where we can make changes quickly and sometimes in real time. In our team meetings, closed captioning is available, and before any communication, we always start by saying who's present. And we have health and wellness days that include mental health days. One of our recent journeys has been that we hired a new employee who is blind. And so I asked her and told her that I was preparing for this discussion today. And I wanted her thoughts, if she was open to sharing them, about how her onboarding process has been, what we can do differently, better, add, change, delete. And she was very gracious about sharing some of her thoughts with me and giving me permission to share them with you today. So she is a psychotherapist who just started with us in October. And so here are some of her thoughts in a nutshell. Number one is that she was thrilled that we hired her. She explained that deciding whether or not to disclose can be a very difficult decision because the reality is that discrimination exists. And actually what she shared was that at her interview with us, which was virtual, she wasn't going to disclose that she was blind. But given the extent that technology is used for us in our world, she felt that that was really important for us to know. What she shared is that we didn't hesitate. We just kind of said, okay, what do you need? How can we help? And so that was a great way, I think, for us to start the rapport. Given that we extended an offer to her, she had shared that she used JAWS, which is a screen reader, but we use a number of different platforms at Layla. I'm going to say at last count, it's probably 6 or 7, probably more if I'm being honest. So we did the research offline, certainly again asked for her input, but behind the scenes and before she arrived, we did a substantial amount of research to figure out which things were compatible with her screen reader. We reached out to the developers. We really tried to kind of understand where pressure points were going to arise, what limitations would look like, and figure out workarounds. And I think she appreciated that. Here's another one. I probably won't surprise anyone here, but she felt really good about the fact that the team asked her to let us know what works rather than us assuming what might work for her. She added that it's been wonderful to be asked for her input because sometimes well-intentioned employers and colleagues have assumed she needs A, B, or C, but it isn't always the case. And as Stephen started today, by saying, people with disabilities are experts in what they need, so it only makes sense that we would ask her. Thinking outside the box is another thing that she commented on. And I think, again, that piece about being creative, I think is really important when we're looking at making things work for folks. She said, and these are her words, I would say that 9 times out of 10 accommodations can be made if the employer is willing and open-minded. And so, for example, one of our platforms that we use pretty routinely categorically will not work with her screen reader, and that's okay because we figured out a workaround. She can use another program to accomplish exactly the same thing, and really everyone's fine with that. It really didn't require a lot of fancy footwork. We just needed to think outside the box. Again, I think this touches on another point she made, but one of her other comments was that Layla Care has taken the lead. And what she said was this, and I think it's really worthwhile to share. She said, although I appreciate that Layla has been asking for my input and addressing my needs in ways I am requesting, it is also great that Layla is doing the legwork. If I'm being honest, having a disability means that you're always advocating for yourself, and that can be exhausting. So sometimes when it's appropriate, we do step up, for example, and talk to a developer about why their platform is not more accessible and that it should be more accessible. So I know that a lot of the folks that she's been working with in our organization have had those discussions, both with her there, but also offline, to say, hey, this is kind of a design flaw and perhaps you need to rethink this. The other thing she really has appreciated, she said, is allowing her to choose when and how she discloses her disability to the team, and also messaging what she needs. So for a concrete example is when we have online meetings like this one, she can't on her feet read the things that we're sharing if we're sharing a presentation with her. It's much preferable to her if she can have those materials in advance, so she can use her screen reader to figure out the context of the meeting and get some overall points. And then she can just listen when we're attending the meeting. So again, that's not a big ask. It's something we can certainly do, but it just requires communicating to the team. And so we've kind of reached out to her at every juncture to ask her what feels good in terms of communicating what you need to the team. So those are some of her thoughts. What we can do differently was also posed to her. The only thing she had to offer us, and again, this will be an iterative process, we'll keep checking in with her, obviously, but some of the tricky parts have been technology related for her, which is not surprising given the number of platforms we use. So onboarding just required a little bit more patience and time, and needed to look a little bit different than it would for a sighted person who could navigate things differently. And so again, we were learning as we went, but it's always an iterative process, and we really didn't hesitate to hire her. She brings a tremendous amount of strength and skill to our team. We're super happy to have her. So these are very small workarounds that we can make happen in order for her to succeed in the way she wants to. I hope that's helpful. Back to you, Stephen.
Oh, I was on mute there. Thank you, Barb. So, Barb, I thought your case of the individual that you recently hired did a really great job, highlighting the second play of accommodation inclusion management, which is prepare. I thought that throughout the story that you were telling, there was different elements, and you even mentioned it a few times of preparation. And so reaching out, identifying key players, not only within your organization, but also externally, such as AIM services that can support you on that journey. So thank you so much. And our next panelist today will be Wendy Porch, the Executive Director for the Center for Independent Living in Toronto. And take it away, Wendy.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you for the invitation to be here and be part of this tremendously relevant and important discussion. I think, historically, we know people with disabilities like myself that our community is underemployed. So having these conversations and talking through the practicalities and the questions and the strategies around how do we address that is a really important conversation. So I'm glad to be here today. As Stephen said, my name's Wendy Porch. I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Independent Living in Toronto. We're also known as CILT, so that's what I'll be referring to. I'm going to talk a little bit about accommodation and workplace culture and how the two can actually blend and complement each other. So next slide, please. I want to tell you a little bit about SILT, my organization. So we are different than some service organizations that you might encounter. We are for persons with disabilities by persons with disabilities. So as I mentioned just now, I am a person with a disability myself. Many of our staff are people with disabilities. The majority of our board is required to be people with disabilities. We also use the term consumer, which is what you'll see on my slide here. We are consumer controlled, meaning we are controlled by the community of people with disabilities, and we're a community-based resource organization. We really worked to try to support people with disabilities in living independently in the community. And we were developed based on the independent living philosophy that says that people with disabilities are the experts. So when we're talking about who knows best in terms of what the community needs or what a specific individual with a disability needs, it is always the person with the disability who will be able to give you that answer much more clearly and in a much more straightforward fashion than anybody else will. So that's inherent to the structure and the values and the mandate of my organization. I feel quite privileged to be working there. Just to say, we were developed in response to other kinds of rehabilitation models that, in particular, may take a medical model approach to disability. We really work to empower the individuals, to empower people with disabilities to make their own choices, to be able to consider the options that are available, even to make mistakes, because as a community, there's often a kind of there's a kind of protection that people try to impose on people with disabilities, and we believe everybody has the right to make whatever choices you want, even if they're bad choices, which seems like a controversial thing to say, but actually just puts everybody with disabilities in the same position as others. So if you could just go to the next slide, please. Next slide. Is it? There we go. Thank you. So our mandate, as I said, is to be an organization by people with disabilities for people with disabilities. We work to collaborate with stakeholders for social and economic equity for people with disabilities. We work to provide opportunities for people with disabilities to learn skills, to live independently in the community. And that is no small task, because it was within our lifetimes that people with disabilities were institutionalized. So the executive director at SILT just before me, the wonderful Sandra Carpenter, lived at a school all year round, a residential school, because there were no supports for her to live in the community. So just to remind everybody that we've made great strides, but it was not that long ago that it was very common for people with disabilities to not only not have a job, but to not live in the community with their families or go to schools with other kiddos in their neighborhood. We work again on programs and activities that empower. We work to empower people with disabilities as community members as well. Next slide, please. So our main programs are offered under these headings. We have core programs, which all IL centers have, and they're peer-based. So when somebody from the community contacts us about a question or an issue or looking for a referral, they're going to talk to another person with a disability about that. We have something called the Direct Funding Program, which is an innovative service model for people who use attendance in their day-to-day life, and it provides the person with a disability with funds to hire their own attendants. So typically those services are accessed through service providers. In the case of the Direct Funding Program, we support those individuals to become their own employers, and they hire their own staff. We support about 1,000 people across Ontario with that program. And the Attendant Service Application Center, we also support and work in partnership with other supportive housing and attendant service providers in the GTA to centralize the application system for that. And we also work on the PSW Training Support Fund. So Many of our services support people with physical disabilities, but we also work particularly around our core programs in partnership with other disability organizations. Next slide, please. As I said, IL philosophy is our foundation. It's at the heart of what we do. The belief that disabled folks like myself and like many of our staff and our board members all just need supports to live in the community, supports and resources, and then the choices that are made are up to them. So we provide resources. We worked to provide those kinds of services that allow people to live independent lives that are led in the same way that everybody's life is, by their interests, by their choices, and by what works for them. Next slide, please. So, SILT is a really unique place in the ways that I've described, but also I think around accessing accommodations at SILT. So because of our mandate, because of who we are, because we're of the community, by the community, for the community, if we don't provide accommodations, we're not actually able to fulfill our mandate. So it is a core part of what we do in terms of making sure that our staff are people from the community, our board members are people from the community. So it's really integrated into just the core fabric of what SILT is. Accommodations that we provide are for staff, for students, for volunteers, and for board members. We encourage people to self-identify. If you need an accommodation, we ask, what kinds of things do you need? But we also actively ask people. It's not just that we say, okay, let us know. We check in with people regularly because we know that, particularly for folks with episodic disabilities, things can change. But we also, it's very important from a management perspective that our management team is very aware of the duty to inquire. And that means that if we think that there's something going on for a staff member that might be related to a need for an accommodation, we must ask if there's any kinds of accommodations that are required that we could provide to facilitate them in getting their work done. We don't require a diagnosis, and nobody can really, but we certainly don't require diagnosis. We don't require personal information. And most of the accommodations that we provide are informally negotiated. So, because we have this kind of understanding of what it takes to be in the community, people, I think, feel open enough to talk to management about what they need, and we make arrangements and we agree, and then we provide the resources for those kinds of accommodations. So next slide, please. So at SILT in our office in the pre-COVID days, when you came to our office, you would see right away that accommodations were important to SILT because SILT always had on staff attendants that worked in our office. So as soon as you walked in the door, you would see where the attendants were stationed. The attendants that we had on staff were extremely skilled, and they were there to support both staff members and board members and people who dropped in and anybody who needed to access those services when they were on the premises at SILT. It was just an integrated part of how we operated. And again, because we know that the expertise lies in the individual with a disability, we really look to individuals to tell us what works. What do you need? Let's figure this out together. Our staff have an understanding as well, not just of, in terms of disability, not just of people with physical disabilities, who is largely the community of folks that we work with and who we support, but also that disabilities can be not so obvious. They can be episodic. People's disabilities can change over time. They can be something that's not visible, and that accommodation needs can differ. We have a range of policies related to accommodations. All of our policies are publicly available on our website. So not just for staff, but if there's anybody else interested, you can see our policies there on accommodations. We do have a spot in our human resources information system where accommodations can be recorded that it's just visible to an individual's manager too. So in terms of there being questions around, does this accommodation go with the person into a new role? We do have a way of keeping track of that. Next slide, please. So the types of accommodations, as I said, we had staff attendants on site. The attendants assisted folks with activities of daily living, like eating, working, grabbing papers, getting dressed to go out. We also have a range of other kinds of accommodations. We have couches in some of our offices for people to rest on. We have yoga mats that people sometimes use near their desk to, if fatigue is an issue and they need to be able to kind of rest throughout the course of the day. Drag and dictate is something that I myself use with a repetitive strain injury in one hand. Typing gets to be a bit much for me. Zoom text. We use Microsoft 365, which has actually made hybrid work, which we've all been in since March of last year, very possible. We also provide alternate formats when people request them. Flexible work hours, flexible breaks. Of course, in the world of home work, this is something that is very possible, but we did that anyway. And we hope and we build a culture that says, you need to take care of yourself. We're here, we can be flexible. Let's talk about how the work gets done. But flexible work hours and flexible breaks is something certainly that our staff engage with. We also allow a relatively high number of sick days to be carried forward. So in terms of our human resources policy, we have a very high number of sick days available to staff to bank. And they are intended specifically as a bridge to LTD if needed. So we do provide LTD, in the case that somebody is unwell and has to access LTD, we provide this extra bit of cushion around sick days so that people can make it to LTD and still be financially secure. So next page, please, next slide. So we integrate accommodations into our operations. We have a dedicated budget line year over year for accommodations. We have a section of our reserve fund that specifically says that parts of our reserve fund can be used for the addition of accessibility features like an electronic door opener, which we have, or any unfunded devices that seem to be clearly needed by staff or by consumers that we don't have any other funding for. So this is an important part of it. We have to have budget to be able to make all of this happen. And I think sometimes what happens is that organizations don't factor in accommodations as a specific budget item. And then when somebody requests it, they don't know where to go and get the money. And I think if you're really truly going to be open to hiring disabled folks, you need to set that money aside and the budget items have to be there. And again, openness to discussions and implementation of accommodations. I think if you talk to folks at SILT, they would tell you it's evident. And I think that builds this kind of culture where people do feel comfortable and confident in saying and approaching their manager to say, I need some accommodations and I really think that this is what might help. So next slide, please. And these are your 5 plays. I just thought I would put them in here. I went through them. I actually think we do most of these things in terms of SILT's processes. So rethinking disability is one of the core elements of what we do. We've certainly prepared. The accommodation policies are important. We do have a process for requesting accommodations and for recording them and for paying for them, frankly, which is very important. Reviewing, evaluating, and evolving. We check in with people on accommodations and we're flexible. And because all of that happens around us, people do come to us when they require an accommodation. And yes, one of the things around the last point there are engaging leaders and creating impact, moving the needle, is that all of us as leaders and as employers have to also look externally when we're moving the needle. So, in terms of just making sure I was listening to the example around the technology that one of the other panelists was using that's not accessible to your staff member. We all need to require that technology that's developed that is for broad use is accessible for everybody. So, some of these messages are messages that I think as employers, our voices are louder together when we can say those same kinds of messages. So next slide for me. Just some recommendations quickly. I was reflecting on this yesterday. Just again, know that disabled people themselves are the experts in knowing what works for them at work. Demonstrate your clear commitment to accommodations. ensure that you have those policies and processes in place. Flexibility is critical here. And finally, dedicated funding. Make sure that you have the money set aside in advance. So thank you, Stephen. That's about it for me. But a real pleasure to be here and to talk to everybody too.
Thank you so much, Wendy. So I was going to highlight one of the plays of AIM based upon your presentation, but you did such a good job on that second last slide there going through it. What I will just say is I think, one thing that really stood out during your presentation, Wendy, was ensuring that the employee is the expert, the person with the disability is the expert. And I think that was highlighted, at various points throughout the presentation, and something that I think speaks to the principles of accommodation and inclusion management really well, but also something that's really important to ensure that we're moving that needle forward as we discussed. So now is the time for the question and answer period. So again, I will read the instructions here. I hope to do a better job than as when we started the presentation. But just a reminder to type your question in the Q&A box or chat. The Q&A feature and the chat will be monitored by the moderator, so I will be monitoring it. You may also raise your hand in Zoom and the panelist will unmute you to ask your question. So I did see that we did have one question come in. Oh, there's two. One has already been answered. So one of our questions was, what does IL stand for? And the answer for that is IL stands for independent living. We also have another question here that I would love to open up to the group of panelists to see if we could address this one. What strategies do you suggest to help address the sometimes negative perceptions of coworkers when they feel someone is receiving preferential treatment because of their accommodation? An example is, I feel like they have to do more work than the person with an accommodation, etc. Do any of our panelists want to, Wendy, you want to take a shot at that one?
It's a tricky question, and it's a question. When I worked at Realize, I worked with the wonderful Realize team years ago before joining Silton. It's certainly a question that came up in the context of that work, where somebody has a disability that maybe is not visible, and people, you don't have to disclose that you have a disability and you're being accommodated, and the coworkers might not have all of the information about what's going on. I think that if you do build this kind of culture of accommodation, that it's okay, not just disability related, but accommodations are provided for family status too, for a range of other things, for people who are caregivers at home. If you build a kind of culture of accommodation that this is what we do to support each other, this is us, these are people getting the supports they need to get their work done, I think it might mitigate some of this, right? And sometimes it gets lost that the accommodations are provided to help people do their work. It's not special treatment. It's so that the job can still get done, right? And I think that sometimes that piece of it gets lost in our messaging around accommodation. I think maybe pulling that out sometimes, that this is still to enable people to do their work, right? It's not a favor to someone. So I think some of that might be helpful.
Great point. Great point.
I just wanted to jump in, thinking about something that you had mentioned earlier, Wendy, about building the culture and doing the training. And I think part of it is that piece where those conversations continue to have life and be at the forefront of any discussions that we have in the organization. I think about those principles of equity that we've all been talking about recently. And I remember going to a conference where someone gave a very concrete example of, asking the people in the audience to take their glasses off and then telling them they can't wear them anymore because it gives them an advantage over everybody else, because now they have something to enhance their vision. And it sort of helped us to think about this in a really different way. And so I think sometimes those are the conversations that as leaders, as managers, as coworkers, that we need to continue to have within our organization, because sometimes there is this perception that someone is getting something else that gives them an advantage where really we're making sure that all of our employees have the tools that they need to be able to, as you said, like work.
Absolutely.
Muna, I love that. And I love that lens of equity versus equality, right? So when I work with kids, as I do, and I do assessments for learning disabilities, sometimes the kids will say, well, if I know I have a learning disability, and okay, I'll get my head around that, but I don't want anyone else to know because I don't want them to think that I'm different or special, or that I'm getting things that the other kids aren't. By getting a computer to use in the classroom, or by sitting further toward the front of the room. And I use that example of glasses, that listen, you know, if someone doesn't see very well and they need glasses, that's their accommodation. And that's just putting them on the same level as everyone else who has perfect vision. So that's not an add-on, that's not an extra, that's just putting them at the same, giving them the same footing. So I appreciate what you're saying, because I think that's a really concrete example to use in any of these instances. And, you know, from my point of view, the expectations for the employee we've just hired who is blind are still the expectations we have for everyone else, in terms of the number of clients she'll carry, in terms of the number of sessions she'll do in a month, the number of assessments she'll complete. That hasn't changed. We're just giving her the tools in order to be able to meet those targets the same way anyone else with sight could do.
Yeah, that the last point really stood out there, Barb, right? Providing the tools for an individual to be, you know, productive and successful in the position, right? And removing barriers to that productivity and success. So we've had a few more questions pop in the chat here. How do we help employers, in particular small and medium-sized enterprises, adopt this approach with persons with disabilities?
Well, I'll jump in because, again, I'm learning on the fly here. I really am. Although I've worked as a clinical psychologist for a really long time, that's really different than knowing how best to welcome folks with disabilities to a startup. So I'm learning, and I think from my vantage learning, I think it's reaching out to people who know what they're talking about and who've done this work, like CCRW, like Loft, and like SILT. So I'm super excited to know about these organizations. And I think that Wendy offered some really great, you know, I've been jotting things down here as we're going, because even that budget line item, right? Like it's just great. If you already have funding available and designated, then it doesn't leave you scrambling. Because to be honest, especially for profit businesses like Layla, you know, sometimes it boils down to what's doable in terms of our budget. But if it's already in the budget and it's just part of who we are and what we do, then it doesn't become a pressure point ever. The money's there, we just use it accordingly. So I really love that suggestion. I'll be taking that back to our leadership team, Wendy. And I like the other suggestions as well, that if you're just building it into the culture and making a playbook right off the bat and consulting with the experts in the community, it just kind of makes it seamless so that it isn't an adjunct, it's just part of what you do.
Can I add something too? I think, you know, this question of how small and medium businesses and how do we get them to adopt this approach? It's also kind of small and medium-sized organizations, right? So I'm from the nonprofit world, and hire people with disabilities. Hire them. Make sure that they come and work there. Have them on your board. You know, there's so many, sometimes we get siloed. We think, you know, if it's a disability issue, then they're going to go to the disability oriented organizations and that's what's going to happen. And, you know, recruitment doesn't really look at disability in terms of a broader part of diversity, but include disability in your understanding of diversity when you're looking for ways to expand the diversity of your staff or your board or your management. Include recruiting people with disabilities for those roles, because this will naturally happen, right? This kind of integration of making sure that people with disabilities can have their needs met in the context of work. Plus, you know, we're all, I don't know about anybody else, but the Great Resignation is a real thing, right? There is a lot of change right now in terms of employment and where people are going. And so, you know, people with disabilities are in a sort of unprecedented way able to work now in ways that they couldn't previously. And so this is an undertapped, not untapped, but, you know, not tapped in the way that we would like, group of people. If you're looking for human resources and you're looking to broaden that perspective of diversity and bring the creativity and the knowledge that comes from the community too, just start hiring people and getting people with disabilities on your board. That would be my big suggestion.
Thank you so much, Wendy. So just checking the time here, I do see that we have reached 2:05, which is the end of our panel presentation for today. So thank you again to our panelists that joined us today. I thought that all of your presentations were great, and they really did speak to accommodation and inclusion management, but also building inclusive workplaces. And I think there was some really good tips provided today that I hope the audience benefited from. So moving on, the next 20 minutes will be an open discussion. It will be a networking session that we will be joining. So if you would like to stay on the line and join the networking session, then you can do so. If not, thank you again for attending today. Steve, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Steve, and to all the panelists. I just found that so informative and helpful, really good tips. In this networking session, we want to hear as well from all those folks that have been, sitting with their cameras off, and what is your experience? What is your experience in arranging appropriate accommodations in the workplace for a person with a disability? It could be yourself, and how have you overcome barriers? We've had a lot of good tips already from our panelists. So once again, as Stephen mentioned, if you want to plug into this, please raise your hand. Our technical folks will change you from being in the audience to being on the panel, so you can speak and we can see you. While that happens, there was a number of good questions we didn't get to, and I want to kind of go back to one of those questions. Lonnie asked, accommodating neurodiversity is challenging, often shows up in practice concern. What are some of the strategies in accommodating? Anybody have experience around that maybe wants to respond to Lanny?
Could I ask for some clarification around practice concerns? I'm not sure what they mean.
Lanny, can you raise your hand and come online and be part of the dialogue? All right, here you are, Lanny. So if you could unmute and share, what are you thinking about in terms of practice? You're presently muted.
There we go. Hi, thank you. I guess, is it on? You can hear me okay?
Yep.
I'm thinking about practice meaning performance. Sorry, I guess issues and we individual, and I guess thinking things that have come to light clearly and invisible, and disability, and they've been working for maybe 1 or 2 years, and then there's issues that have arisen, and it's come to light now that there is some medical basis in terms of the capacity to manage a certain workload. Let's say we do case management, so in that sense, so that's part of it. And I'll sneak in another question because I just don't know how to get around employers who are so medically focused. It's all got to have medical and a diagnosis. So those are my two burning issues. Thank you.
Any experience with those questions?
I don't have any experience around the neurodiversity question. I would love to hear from anyone who has some concrete examples of how that's worked. I did want to speak a little bit, though, about the medically focused one. It is something that as an organization, we have been struggling with. We have about 800 employees, and we use a third-party organization to support ergonomic assessments, leaves of absence as well. And the feedback we've received from our staff, who are very bright, because we work in the mental health field, is that when people have gone off on leaves due to mental health difficulties or challenges, our third-party provider just can't figure that piece out. And so as an organization, we have now tried to build up our competency around that in supporting staff who have challenges that the third-party provider hasn't been able to navigate. And I would say that it's been amazing for us because it's caused our directors to have conversations with our staff to hear what's actually happening for them in terms of the needs that they have in returning to work. And that's made a lot of the difference. I think one of the threads that's been going through our conversations is just speak to people about what their challenges are and what the needs are. Caseload has been a challenge for some, and we've looked at, increasing as we go along or offering different things. So sometimes they've identified that they can only carry a certain caseload, and then we found other work for them to do so that they're still able to do that. That has really been staff-led. I mean, there are parameters with regards to what we can reasonably manage because we do still need to see our clients, but we've been pretty successful in having our staff talk to us about, like, these are the needs that we have, as opposed to having this third-party provider say, what happened to you? When did this happen to you? Like, what's your diagnosis? What are all these pieces, when that isn't really what we need? We've been looking more at what is the solution to help you work effectively, as opposed to like, what's all your history, 10 years ago. So yeah, I would say that it's just really about talking to the staff about what they need and then figuring out, like, what is it that we can still do?
Thanks so much for that. Wendy, go ahead.
I'm reflecting a little bit on the two questions. So in terms of the medical piece, insurance providers always require some of that, right? I think that's just part and parcel of the way that insurance is provided. But short of that, in terms of what the approach that we take is, somebody identifies that they need an accommodation, or it's a conversation that's driven by a manager who says, I've kind of noticed, these are the things I've noticed. Is there something that we could be providing in the context of accommodation for you? And then we actually experiment, right? Like because we have money that we set aside, we say, okay, well, what do you think would work? Let's have a look. And everybody's Googling things and tracking things down. And then, somebody will say, well, I think maybe that, for example, maybe that tablet will work for me because it's not so keyboard focused. I can use a stylus, and okay, well, let's try it. And then we buy it and we try it out and we check back in, and is this working the way that it's supposed to or not? And frankly, like some of those things are things that can be repurposed. If that's not working for that individual, it could work for somebody else, right? So we have, for example, like mini keyboards that are around in the office. We've got we've got a tablet, like we've got things that can then get reallocated to folks that need it, right? So it's not a bad investment usually. And that's not medically oriented. We're not talking about anybody. You can't be talking about diagnosis in the context of accommodation anyway. You should not be talking about a medical diagnosis, right? But then the question around the folks who are neurodivergent in a work context, and just to say, Lanny, like, I think if people are not accommodated, regardless of whether it's somebody who's neurodivergent or somebody with a physical disability or somebody with a mental health related disability, it can look like a performance issue, right? So it can show up as a performance issue when really it's, you know, somebody's trying and they're dedicated and they have the skills, but there's this disconnect for them in one direction or another. And I guess, you know, and I don't want you to tell me anything in particular about this individual, but, you know, I guess it's the same process, right? Like to say to the person, okay, so these are the things that we've observed. We'd really like, you know, you're an important part of our team. And if there's something that we can do here in terms of accommodations that might be useful and will have an impact here, let's talk about it. What do you think we could do together that would make a difference in terms of supporting you to do your work? We hired you because you're good at this, and we want to support you in being able to do it. Just thinking a little bit about it.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's helpful.
thanks, Wendy. I'm just looking at the clock, and I want to turn to Ian and then Jennifer, who have come on and wanted to share some of their experiences, a comment or question. Ian, you're up.
Actually, I just joined kind of for the heck of it, but I guess I can comment to. I'm currently in that process of. I'm on LTD leave right now. I have. I don't mind disclosing that I have a psychiatric disability, a pretty significant bipolar disorder, some COVID-related stress ended up being a trigger last year, and I've had. Frankly, a real difficult time with both my union and the employer in terms of, and I think specifically, in fact, part of my situation does include some addiction issues, and so I'm not sure I have much to offer other than there's work that needs to be done there, and I'm here as a representative of my union even so. You know, I'm a union activist. I'm a believer in this. So anyway, I just really want to thank everybody for your comments, and it's been great. It's stuff that I can take back and advocate within my union, because what I've kind of decided was I was looking at going complaint process and that sort of thing. But in the last couple of days attending the conference here, I was thinking maybe I'll take the approach more of approaching my union and say, hey, this has been my experience. Can we look at it and go more of a proactive, you know, sort of problem solving, break it down route, and at least give that a shot. So thanks.
Ian, you know, it's so encouraging to hear you talk about the impact of hearing from others. Like, none of us have all the answers. And it is engaging with others, hearing the stories, learning, trying to apply them that is so important, and you're living it. Thank you so much. I want to turn to Jennifer next.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks, Ian, so much for sharing your story. I just wanted to talk a little bit about, I work at a university now, and I worked sort of in the insurance world for quite a while, and in terms of the sort of needing the medical piece. And I think the rationale that we've provided within the workplace as well is that, you know, you can have 10 people who have the same diagnosis on paper, but their function and how it impacts their function is completely different. And so what we want to really be looking at, I think as all of the participants had mentioned, is how is your medical condition impacting your function in terms of work, and what supports do you need in order to be able to accommodate you? And that really moves away from needing to know all of the medical and what the diagnosis is. That's even for a third-party provider, it's not really necessary. It's how's it impacting your function. So I think that's been a way to just provide a rationale as well around why this history of medical and diagnosis is really not necessary in many cases.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. There's a comment and kind of question in the chat from Kathleen. She says, I'm a shop steward and assist employees. Often there are many misconceptions about accommodation process, both from the employee and the employer. Many employees do not want to disclose or self-identify because of stigma. At the time they do, then they are often at a breaking point and will end up on leave or leave employment altogether. I have had employees ask, what can I ask for? What will help me with this type of issues? What is available? But I might not be as familiar with the challenges for that particular disability or what has worked for others with similar challenges. Are there resources for how to do this? Anybody want to jump in on that one?
I'll excuse me, I'll just jump in, and I think this is, I really thank you, Kathleen, for sharing this, because I think this is probably emblematic of the way a lot of folks feel when they're trying to liaise with employers. They just don't know, like, what am I entitled to? What's okay to ask for? How will other people view me if I ask for that? And I think it really, it's really tricky, because if you have an employer who isn't especially skilled in helping with that process, it makes it very challenging and awkward and doesn't feel great. There are lots of resources out there. I put one in our chat. I hope folks can see it. It's called askjan.org. Maybe people already know about this one, but it's called the Job Accommodation Network. So what's really neat about it is that it does break things down by diagnosis, but also functional ability. So for example, you might have a difficulty with memory because of some condition. No one needs to know that condition, but memory is challenging. So if you click on memory, it will kind of give you some practical examples of what kinds of things can be helpful to people who are struggling with that particular issue. So I'm not a lawyer, and obviously someone else who is here who may be a lawyer can jump in, but my understanding is you are under no obligation to disclose a diagnosis to your employer. That's not on you. And they're not entitled to ask. So even if they are quite medically driven, and a physician has said, this person requires these accommodations, the physician is under no obligation to say why. So know that, because again, I think a lot of people just don't know. And, if an employer asks, they tell. But you don't need to. That's up to you. So as my colleague Wendy was saying, it's okay to just say, hey, I'm struggling with these things. They're getting in the way of me doing my job productively or efficiently. Can we talk about ways that we can get around that? And I know that might be a difficult conversation to have, but I'm hopeful that's a good starting point anyway, especially if you already have some ideas about what would be helpful to you, and some things that maybe don't even cost money, like having a quieter space in which to work, or some tech devices that maybe are already there in the organization.
This is such an important question, and we're just about out of time. I want to come back to what folks talked about right at the beginning of this session, was to prepare. And oftentimes the union doesn't see that it's their role. This is a management role to accommodate. But in fact, the union has a really important role to play there. But if it's taken as a one-off, it's really tough to do that. But if you prepare ahead of time, if within the union you develop policies and procedures and understanding about the process, it's going to be so much easier to actually deal with the issue when it comes up. As I said, we're in our last 30 seconds. Sorry, we can't get to everybody who wants to chip in on this. Really good discussion. Thank you so much all for all your tips and sharing your experiences. It's really been worthwhile. I want to encourage people to potentially follow up with any of the presenters you've seen here today. Their links are on the conference website. Their bios are there. Keep working with each other. Here are all these resources. Here are these people who've been through it. Get in touch, build those links, and it's going to serve you well going forward. Again, thank you so much. to everyone. And Stephen, you did a great job moderating. Have a great rest of the conference, everybody. See you later.